live. We're now on live stream in YouTube. So pleasant afternoon to all. We'll be waiting for the participants to come in. So we have now the link for the YouTube live stream. Janos.
Yes, sir.
The problem is that we cannot copy the link from the chat room. You have to send it through the email.
Okay.
You were able to copy Amabeth? So we're now live. So we're now live.
Only live active, but we're not yet starting the webinar. So, wait. So we can start. I can start the webinar now if you like. Game. Live active, but we're not yet starting the webinar. So, okay. Shall I press start?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Wait. Dr. Palumbarit. Okay, go ahead, Janus.
I will press start webinar.
Good.
Abot pa tayo ng 500.
We are still waiting for the 100. We're still 113. We're waiting for other participants to join us.
when the only notion constant is change, when information is obtainable with a single click of the mouse or a tap of a screen, humans seem to be at the center of it all, making them in sync with the changes, in constant motion. This is not limited to those living in cities whose hands seldom part with their gadgets. In rural areas, the innovations and discoveries in technologies are used to ease lives and bridge gaps in knowledge, skills, and practices. With the new knowledge and information being created, reproduced, and shared at a rapid pace, people constantly need to retool themselves to keep up with continuously changing work requirements. In today's digital age, people need to learn how to learn and learn anywhere and anytime. The University of the Philippines Open University, the fifth constituent unit of the University of the Philippines system, provides opportunities for people to pursue further studies through open and distance e-learning. In February 23, 1995, the University of the Philippines Open University was established. It is mandated to provide Filipinos all over the world wider access to quality higher education through open and distance e-learning, or ODEL. UPOU now offers various degree programs to learners located in more than 70 countries all over the world. These programs are under the Faculty of Education, the Faculty of Information and Communication Studies, and the Faculty of Management and Development Studies. UPOU also offers continuing education courses and massive open and distance e-learning courses. UPOU uses various information and communication technologies, computer programs and applications to deliver instructional content and connect teachers and learners all over the world. Now more than ever, UPOU continues to transcend borders and break barriers through constant generation of knowledge and open exchange of ideas. It persistently tries new mechanisms to reach a larger number of learners. It perseveres in mentoring learners who shall be change agents, equipped to participate in the co-creation of knowledge for the benefit of Filipino communities everywhere. True to its mission, UPOU shall continue to reinvent itself to provide 21st century education in an increasingly open world.
There you go. The organizers of this webinar, the ASEAN Center, University of the Philippines, and the University of the Philippines Open University. Okay, so I know that you're all seated comfortably there in your seats. However, may I request a minute of your time to please stand up for the Philippine National Anthem to be followed by the ASEAN hymn.
Raise our flag high, sky high, and raise the pride in our hearts. ASEAN, we are one and going out to the world. Very start and prosperity to last. We dare to dream, we dare to share together for ASEAN. We dare to dream, we dare to share, for it's the way of
Please be seated. Welcome again to this webinar entitled ASEAN Centrality Up Close and Personal. I am Michelle Palumbarig, faculty of the Asian Center, and will be your moderator for today. And now, to formally open this program and welcome us all, I present Dr. Jean Saludades, Program Chair, ASEAN Studies Program, and Vice Chancellor for Finance and Administration, UP Open University.
Thank you, Dr. Palumbari. I wish to welcome you all to this webinar titled ASEAN Centrality, Up Close and Personal. It is jointly organized by the Asian Center and the University of the Philippines Open University's ASEAN Studies Graduate Program in celebration of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations' 53rd founding anniversary. The partnership between the Asian Center and the UPOU ASEAN Studies Graduate Program has a long history and has always been productive and fruitful, particularly in the implementation of the ASEAN Studies Graduate Program, including the promotion of the program to potential students. At this point, let me be up close and personal in these welcome remarks. On January 4, 2018, I received an email from Dean Jove Santarita with New Year's greetings and an introduction of Ambassador Elizabeth Buen-Suceso, who was then the permanent representative of the Philippines to ASEAN. I was glad to receive such an introduction, thinking of a possible support from the government for the ASEAN Studies Graduate Program. Reading the email further, I was amused because the introduction was made for the reason that Ambassador Buen-Suceso was interested in the UPOU's Master of ASEAN Studies program. I thought, why does she have to enroll in the program? We can just give her an honoris causa for the work she has done in ASEAN. But she was determined to take the course due to the online nature of the program, as it would allow her to perform her duties while studying. To make the story short, in February 2018, she was admitted to the program, and in July 2020, she completed the program to be conferred the academic degree ceremonially at the UP Open University's virtual graduation that will happen in November this year. What she will be presenting today is her thesis on ASEAN Centrality. At the Asianology course, where students' final requirement is a thesis proposal, Ambassador Buen-Suceso posted at our forum that she chose this topic because there is yet no definition of the term, and how it is played out by ASEAN will spell the difference of whether or not ASEAN will remain relevant in the future. She continued, I will take advantage of my unique position as a practitioner and student of Asianology to obtain answers to this gap. And I recommended that she should explore the use of autoethnography as a means of knowing, given her rich ASEAN diplomacy experience. Her reply, I have never heard of autoethnography before. I will start reading up. She added, I have been wondering what framework to use to complement my practical experience. This should be a big help. Before the Oceanology course ended, she posted at the forum, I had originally planned to write my research using a detached from the culture stance, since I am investigating a serious aspect of ASEAN diplomacy, which is ASEAN centrality. Autoethnography is changing all of that because it wants me to write personal accounts and be immersed in the subculture of ASEAN diplomacy. She ended by saying, however, I am excited by the prospect of recounting my journey as a member of this subculture, as no one has ever attempted this before. As her thesis advisor, I was awed that while already knowledgeable on ASEAN, Ambassador Bensuceso was still ready to learn. I'm sure the other members of the thesis committee, Dean Santerita and former UPOU Chancellor, Dr. Grace Alfonso, will agree with me on that observation. As the program chair, I am pleased and privileged that we admitted her to the program. What we will hear today is ASEAN centrality, up close and personal, with touch of scholarship. After the lecture, we can expect a lively discussion with very distinguished panelists, the Philippine Ambassador to Australia, Her Excellency Maria Helen de la Vega, ASEAN Secretariat's ASEAN Political Security Community Department's Director of External Relations, Mr. Balakumar Palanyapan, and Asian Center Dean, Dr. Jope Santerita. Again, welcome to the webinar and good day.
Thank you, Dr. Saludades. And now, to introduce our speaker, I present to you Professor Rolando Talampas, Faculty, Asian Center, and Affiliate Faculty at the UP Open University. Sir.
Thank you, Professor Palombarit. Good afternoon. Magandang hapon. Salamat. Sorry. I would like to introduce our guest, our keynote main speaker and resource person for today's webinar, being very close to her for some time. As already mentioned by Dr. Jean Saludades, we have known her as a very important source for ASEAN studies. Briefly, without taking much time, may I say Ambassador Elizabeth Bensuceso is the officer in charge, Undersecretary for Policy, Department of Foreign Affairs, Republic of the Philippines. She is also the Philippine representative to the ASEAN Senior Officials Meeting leader and to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, or the AICHR. She was, until recently, the ambassador, permanent representative of the Philippines to the ASEAN for 6 years, and was also the former ambassador to Laos and Norway, with concurrent accreditation to Denmark and Iceland. She has been with the Philippine Foreign Service for more than 39 years. Ambassador Bensuceso majored in English and graduated magna cum laude. And she is now a candidate for graduation in October 2020 for the degree of Master in ASEAN Studies at the UP Open University. In 2017, she was awarded the Presidential Grand Cross, Gawad Kamanong, rank of Commander. If we really are determined to know more about ASEAN, I can say that this is how close we can get to one of our very own. Professor Ambassador Bensuceso's long years of involvement and advocacy relative to the ASEAN and Philippine participation in the ASEAN are our basis for saying that Ambassador Beth Bensuceso is ASEAN in the flesh. Thank you and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. First, allow me to thank the Asian Center through Dean Jofe Santa Rita and the University of the Philippines Open University, UPOU, for organizing this seminar. I am especially happy to see the Philippine Ambassador to Australia, Ambassador Helen de la Vega, who was formerly the Director General for ASEAN Philippines, who I consider my kindred spirit when it comes to ASEAN matters. Hello, Ambassador Helen. And of course, Director Bala of the ASEAN Secretariat Political and Security section or division. These two are co-participants. We are dramatis personae in this ASEAN drama that I am going to share with you. And this too is your story. The title of my study is ASEAN Centrality, an Auto-Ethnographic Account by a Philippine Diplomat. Why did I go into this study? And why did I choose this topic? Centrality is one of the most important principles of ASEAN. The need to maintain the centrality and proactive role of ASEAN as the primary driving force in its relations and cooperation with its external partners in a regional architecture that is open, transparent, and inclusive is enshrined in Article 1 of the ASEAN Charter. There have been many diverging views about ASEAN centrality proffered by ASEAN's external partners, academics, and outside observers. In March last year, I represented the Philippines in the first ever high-level dialogue on Indo-Pacific cooperation hosted by Foreign Minister Retno of Indonesia. In that forum, I heard the dialogue partners of ASEAN express support for and respect for ASEAN centrality. However, listening to how divergent views of what ASEAN centrality is has convinced me that there is indeed a need for ASEAN or an insider from of ASEAN to come up with a practical definition of ASEAN centrality. In that forum, I said that ASEAN centrality should be the foundational principle upon which Indo-Pacific cooperation is to be pursued. Indo-Pacific cooperation's agenda should be the ASEAN agenda as manifested or indicated in seminal documents like the ASEAN Charter, the Vision 2025, the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity, etc. And the mechanisms and processes of Indo-Pacific cooperation should be the ASEAN-led processes and mechanisms such as ARF, EAS, ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN Plus 1, etc. And so therefore, after this high-level dialogue, I said I must do a study of ASEAN centrality. As I said, many researchers and academics have put forward their own views and definitions of ASEAN centrality. And insider's definition would be a credible foundation of what it is in principle, in practice, and will be a useful gauge in dealing with ASEAN. It is also a response to a call by some academics for ASEAN policymakers to make clear in no uncertain terms what they mean by ASEAN centrality. What exactly do ASEAN policymakers mean when they say being in the driver's seat? I also have personal reasons for telling this story. Another important question to be answered would be, why this unconventional method of study? I will answer that in a little while. Researchers and academics have proffered a number of views and definitions of ASEAN centrality. Those on the other extreme end of the spectrum say, what ASEAN centrality? There's no such thing. It doesn't exist. They said, ASEAN cannot even make up its mind or do not have a common position on issues like the South China Sea or human rights or the Northern Rakhine issue. So what ASEAN centrality are you talking about? I don't know. Some people in the audience might have a similar view. I will talk about that also later. Others, such as Amitav Acharya, a leading ASEAnologist, define ASEAN centrality as a natural fabrication of the dynamics of great power relationships obtaining in the region. ASEAN, he says, merely accepted its role in the middle, being in the middle of this geopolitical milieu. Still others, such as Nelly Caballero Anthony, have a similar view. They say that the ASEAN centrality is naturally created. So it's a creation, naturally created by close and dense ties with other actors in the network of institutions in East Asian regionalism. And most importantly, she says, by acting, ASEAN acting as the node that bridges these networks. But such definitions seem to portray ASEAN's centrality as an accident of geophysical circumstances and not as an active creation by ASEAN itself, as depicted in my study. ASEAN makes ASEAN centrality, I say, in the face of conflicting rivalry and regional dynamics. Most researchers and even ASEAN policymakers mention the leadership role of ASEAN, and even the term driver's seat has been coined. But how ASEAN assumes a leadership role or practices being in the driver's seat needs an operational definition. This is where I jump off from the existing definitions of ASEAN centrality. My research question is, what is ASEAN centrality to a Philippine diplomat? That's me. And how does the meaning of ASEAN centrality define the involvement of a Filipino diplomat and the Philippines in the ASEAN community? Here is my analytical framework or research method. Existing literature on ASEAN diplomacy, multilateralism, and ASEAN centrality are mostly by researchers and academics using objective methods and employing a neutral voice. I agree with Brigg and Keller description of the state of play in literature on international relations being or going out of their way to distance the self from the topic. On the other hand, existing anthologies on autoethnography do not include any on diplomacy, much less ASEAN diplomacy. Of course, memoirs are an entirely different world. After overcoming my initial hesitation to use autoethnography in discussing ASEAN centrality, I found out that it is in fact the best platform to tell my story. I take inspiration from Ellis, Adams, and Buckner, who in 2011 defined autoethnography as a type of research that seeks to describe and systematically analyze the researcher's personal experiences in order to understand cultural, and in this case, political phenomena. There should be no shame nor guilt, they say, in using personal narratives and perspectives in the quest for truth and knowledge, and instead regard the result of such a method as one that best approximates truth, being based on personal experiences. The Handbook of Autoethnography by Holman Jones et al. Lists the following characteristics, goals of autoethnographies, which I relate in my study. Number 1, autoethnography purposefully comments or critiques cultural practices. I recount my observations of the unique political and sociocultural setting of the community of diplomats that I belong to in Jakarta, and Director Bala was also a native of that community. 2, making contributions to existing research, which I already explained earlier. On the one hand, no autoethnography on ASEAN diplomacy or diplomacy exists. And on the other hand, writings about ASEAN diplomacy all use the objective method in analyzing ASEAN diplomacy. Number 3, embracing vulnerability and purpose. This I am able to achieve by adopting a descriptive realist voice when narrating the experiences, interspersed with a confessional, emotive tone. For example, in my eagerness, Ambassador de la Vega perhaps remembers this, in my eagerness to, achieve difficult milestones during our chairmanship, I think I became over enthusiastic and may have hurt the feelings of one of our officials with my memorandum, and because I wanted to finish that task quickly, and I quickly apologized, and to this day we are still very good friends. So this is the confessional emotive element in this autoethnography. 4th is disrupting norms of research practice and representation, or breaking silence. Choosing to use this method for a topic like ASEAN diplomacy and centrality in this field, which has mainly used objective methods in a masculine voice, as mentioned earlier. I break silence by using an unusual method hitherto used only for naturally emotional and emotive topics like LGBT, racial discrimination, adoption, those kinds of topics. So ASEAN diplomacy, autoethnography, this is a rare combination. The 5th goal or element of autoethnography is that it is working from an insider's knowledge. And of course, I possess this characteristic because I have the period I am describing was the time I was ambassador of the Philippines to ASEAN for 6 years. For its conceptual framework, the study's jump-off point was the analytical autoethnography model proposed by Leon Anderson. You see, Anderson said there must be another way for serious topics like international relations, for example, or people like me to do autoethnography. And so he proposed this analytical model. The left side of the diagram shows myself at the focus of the research. So I also study myself as a member of that community that I am studying. In fact, I am the center of this study. As a full member of that community or a group of diplomats engaged in ASEAN relations. I was an active member of that group. Here you see the subsets of this ethnic community that I belong to. And these are the Committee of Permanent Representatives, CPR, ACCC, ASEAN IPR, ASEAN Plus One, EAMJ, and ASEAN Plus One. On the right side of your diagram, you see the characteristics of this ethnic group. So the characteristics of this ethnic groups it will be the focus of my study as well. This particular group of diplomats, they have a certain way of tone and language of dealing with each other. They have their own agenda. They pursue their agenda. They have their own processes and mechanisms, and they have particular regard for values such as, of course, ASEAN centrality. Even the physical format of these settings and the resiliency of ASEAN to proceed with its agenda despite huge differences and lack of consensus in difficult areas, and of course the level of awareness about ASEAN. These are things that I study in this research. A note about reflexivity. Reflexivity means that the researcher is the focus of the study. So as I mentioned earlier, there should be no doubt or guilt in allowing the researcher to be to look back and recall these incidents and do a valid research on these recollections. For ethical guidelines, I tried to follow some of those that were advised by Gillian Tullis, such as I hide the gender of some of the characters. I do not mention characters by name if I think that the topic is sensitive enough. But I do mention those that I think will not mind or even would be happy to see their names in my study. For example, I mention, of course, the officers and staff of my of the Philippine mission to ASEAN, with whom they are my extended selves, as a manner of speaking. For my data or field notes, autoethnographic materials like Google Calendar, social media posts, memorandums, press releases in the DFA and mission websites, and the very useful diplomatic briefing paper were used in this study. My finished product is a new definition of ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality. So here are the results of my study. The first is, these are the three dimensions of the definition of ASEAN centrality that I came up with. One is ASEAN centrality is an expression of ASEAN leadership in the region, and with particular focus on the Philippine chairmanship of ASEAN in 2017. I must acknowledge the very strong role as well of Ambassador de la Vega in the achievement of milestone accomplishments during the Philippine chairmanship. I recount my impression of anxiety and eagerness to assume the role of chair of ASEAN, since chairmanship comes only once every 10 years for a country, and for a diplomat like me and Ambassador Helen, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to celebrate the 50th founding anniversary of ASEAN. Chairmanship is a rare opportunity to be able, for the chair to be able to show leadership in the region by delivering important initiatives close to its heart and to advance an agenda which it believes should help advance or shape the political and socio-economic landscape of the region that is facing a great number of challenges. This the Philippine chairmanship of ASEAN in 2017 did when it delivered several milestone documents, at least 29 major ones. Some of these achievements are the Manila Consensus on Migrant Workers, the framework for the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea, gender mainstreaming in all the 3 pillars of the ASEAN community, etc. The ASEAN Convention on Trafficking in Persons, with special focus on women and children, also became enforceable that year when I delivered the instrument of ratification on a date to coincide with International Women's Day. You see, I don't know if Ambassador de la Vega is aware of this. You see, I received the instrument of ratification and was instructed to deliver it immediately to the Secretary General, Le Luong Min. I did not. I calculated the number of days because under ASEAN norms, an agreement enters into force 30 days after the last 6th country has deposited the instrument of ratification. So I counted a specific number of days so that the active became enforceable on International Women's Day. So every year on International Women's Day, we celebrate the coming into force of the active. So a lot of achievements, I can give you a list of this, and ASEAN Secretariat also has a list of all these achievements during the Philippine chairmanship. On my part, I chose to accomplish deliverables close to my and the Philippines' heart, including a tribute to the founding fathers of ASEAN, ASEAN Heroes of Biodiversity, ASEAN Rise Science and Technology Ambassadors, etc. I also chaired the negotiation of various documents, including EAS leaders' declarations and statements, 4 of them, plans of action, and the external relations section of the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting Joint Communique. I even organized an EAS mangrove planting activity to raise awareness on biodiversity. However, and here comes a vulnerable moment, our desire to show this kind of leadership in the region has taken a toll in the personal lives of the officers and staff of my mission. I recount a moment when, after the chairmanship, the last chairmanship responsibility was over, I took my staff to the resort town of Bogor for a retreat. And there we poured out our postponed grief, suffering, and tensions that we endured during our chairmanship. The second dimension of my definition demonstrated ASEAN centrality as a principle of ASEAN diplomacy, with ASEAN playing a dominant role. The study recounted my experiences practicing ASEAN diplomacy as a participant observer of the 6 subgroups in the community I belonged to and chaired in 2017. These bodies, in what we now call the Jakarta Channel, are the Committee of Permanent Representatives CPR, the ACCC ASEAN Connectivity Coordinating Committee, the ASEAN Plus One, so 10 dialogue partners, ASEAN Plus the US, ASEAN Canada, ASEAN China, etc. IPAR at that time, ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, we changed it now to ASEAN IPR, and the EAMJ, the EAS, Meeting of Ambassadors in Jakarta. Here are some examples of how the ASEAN centrality was practiced in these bodies. I don't have time to recount to you all, but I'll just mention a few. For example, the CPR, in compliance with its terms of reference, sought to pursue the ASEAN agenda, particularly the attainment of the chair's goals and objectives in its dealing among its own members and in their interaction with ASEAN's external partners. To strengthen its own mechanism, the CPR sought to amend the roles and functions of the Joint Consultative Meeting to enable it to become the main coordinating body for the three pillars of the ASEAN community. I illustrated how the CPR chose. I want to again acknowledge the important role that Ambassador de la Vega played in realizing this CPR's aspiration when we brought that matter up to the senior officials of ASEAN. I illustrated how the CPR chose who to interact with and who should be avoided. Even in its meetings with high-level officials, the CPR explained and even insisted on ASEAN's agenda, formats, and practices in dealing with them. Examples of how ASEAN used the ASEAN way of informal, non-confrontational tone and language were also provided. For example, one of the main responsibilities of the CPR was to approve the budget of the ASEAN Secretariat. Unlike in the Philippines, when we couldn't have the budget approved, we just used last year's budget. In this case, the ASEAN Secretariat had to have a budget. So I think it was some misunderstanding on the part of one member state. Instead of naming and shaming this member state, I quietly sought the help of their higher-ups. Younger officers there couldn't make decisions, perhaps, or were very shy, I don't know. So again, very quietly, I sought the help of the senior officials of this member state, and very quickly they sent somebody who could make decisions. One of the most interesting discoveries I made while undertaking this study was the fact that ASEAN centrality was demonstrated in its agenda. What is not in the agenda of ASEAN is as important as what is in the agenda of ASEAN. So, what is not in the agenda of ASEAN is the bilateral disputes that have plagued ASEAN for decades or even centuries. So it's not there. And so there are appropriate forums for such bilateral disputes. For example, Thailand and Cambodia went to the International Court of Justice to settle their differences on the Srivijaya Temple. And it's now settled. Even the, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Malaysia, etc. There are appropriate forums or platforms to discuss these matters. They are not in the agenda of ASEAN. But of course, ASEAN has already specified the ASEAN agenda, as I said, in the seminal documents like Vision 2025, Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity, and now we are thinking of the successor document to the Vision 2025. So this is the ASEAN agenda, and we ask our external partners, please follow the ASEAN agenda. In the IPR, ASEAN demonstrated its ability to achieve centrality in the establishment, this is my baby, of the ASEAN Women for Peace and Reconciliation, OPAR. I call it Awesome OPAR. And in the beginning, I first conceived of this in 2015 where after we organized the symposium on enhancing the role of women in peace and reconciliation processes. It took 3 years for it to be realized because in the beginning it didn't find support among all member states, naturally, because not everybody has peace and reconciliation initiatives or experts. But ASEAN centrality is demonstrated in the fact that even in such a topic, we were able to come together and push for the awesome OPAR initiative. In the ASEAN +1 mechanisms, ASEAN centrality was seen when refusing to be lectured on by a Western external partner on an issue that divided us. CPR meetings with high-level officials of its dialogue partners, including Vice President Michael Pence and State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, were recounted whereby ASEAN followed its own format, agenda, and objectives in the conduct of the meetings. I recount how, just on the eve of the issuance of an ASEAN +1 leader statement, we strongly opposed the move by one major partner to change the entire nature and objectives of one document on cybersecurity we were negotiating, leading to the collapse of the talks. I think you were there, Bala, when this happened. Sayang, we say in Filipino. It was a very important document, but we couldn't, allow a partner to just change the nature and objectives of that document overnight. However, it is in the EAS, East Asian Summit, where ASEAN experienced the most dramatic tests to its centrality. ASEAN demonstrated it by beating the stonewalling strategy of some of its external partners who have refused to endorse the EAS mechanism in Jakarta to give it the ability to negotiate documents and advantage point for ASEAN. ASEAN centrality was also exercised in the insistence of ASEAN to add maritime cooperation as a focus area despite stiff opposition, and its tenacity to follow its own processes in negotiating documents, particularly in their insistence to use an ASEAN draft as the negotiating text. You know that doing that is advantageous to ASEAN. I recount the negative reaction of some of our external partners when I introduced this mode of negotiation. The non-ASEAN colleagues did not like what I did, and they reported me to my home office. Fortunately, home office upheld this move. It was also apparent in the manner when we defeated the strategy of some external partners to postpone negotiations for our EAS work plan. It was also apparent in the manner and results of the negotiations of the EAS leader statements and action plans that the body negotiated in 2017, when non-ASEAN partners tried to delay, influence, and change paragraphs to reflect their national positions or even collapse talks when they found it advantageous to do so. I recount the dramatic conduct of negotiations on the eve of the EAS summit when there was a huge chance for me and the Philippines to fail in finalizing all the 4 EAS leaders' declarations that we were negotiating. Too many, and there are too many, and it's too detailed to enumerate them here, but here are 2 examples. One of them is the mention of the name of the chemical agent. It's called VX nerve agent in the attack of Kim Jong-nam in a Malaysian airport early in 2017. somehow even ASEAN, it took us a long time to come to a consensus. And then some member states, of course, did not want the mention of the nerve agent in the text of the ASEAN statement. So the ASEAN ingenious way of solving this problem was to mention the particular CWC, Chemical Weapons Convention resolution that mentions the name of the agent, but in the ASEAN text we don't mention the name of the agent, of the nerve agent, because it's already mentioned in that Chemical Weapons Convention resolution. Another example is the EAS leader statement on countering terrorist ideologies. For some reason, some member states, even non-member states, had a reservation in the term terrorist ideology. Perhaps it had something to do with, religion being used as an excuse to blame religion in terrorism, in the terrorist activities or attacks that were happening all over the world. So, very simply, the ASEAN solution to that was rename it. It became now, you can check in the website, EAS Leaders Statement on Countering the Spread of Ideologies which Encourage Terrorism. So quite a mouthful, but everybody was happy, and that's the ASEAN way of solving our problem. In the end, we managed to reconcile all divergent positions, and the EAS leaders issued the document. Ambassador De La Vega and I had a very cute anecdote when the chair of the EAS ad-libbed the adoption of these 4 EAS declarations. Anyway, third dimension of my definition of ASEAN centrality is how I've been influenced by this subjective view to raise the level of awareness on ASEAN in various platforms. I recounted my experience when I guested in the Perspectives show of Channel News Asia, confronted by co-panelists who were not as enthusiastic about ASEAN as myself. They raised a number of issues. They were business people, and it was natural for them to have some issues with ASEAN. Some strong words were used to describe ASEAN. And fortunately, in the end, we were able to come to an understanding that indeed the peace and stability that ASEAN has prosecuted over the last 50 years or so have helped businesses thrive and prosper in ASEAN. I also recounted the incident when I was a speaker in the Maritime Forum in Victoria, Canada, where I called, this was in 2017, where I called for new regional architecture with ASEAN playing a leading and an important role in shaping the socio-economic, political, and security architecture of our region. Indeed, as I am doing now, I have given several talks in various universities, in the member states, in the Philippines, in various cities, and I have become virtually the Johnny Appleseed of ASEAN awareness. And even here in the UP Asian Center, they hosted a memorable event called ASEANale 2018, where I enjoined the leaders of ASEAN, the people of ASEAN, to tell their own ASEAN story. So in conclusion, ASEAN centrality, based on my subjective account, is an expression of ASEAN leadership in the region. It is a principle of diplomacy practiced by ASEAN diplomats, whereby ASEAN plays a dominant role. This was shown in the researchers' participation in the various mechanisms based in Jakarta. And finally, ASEAN Centrality is an aspiration by myself to raise the level of awareness about ASEAN Centrality. From my point of view, ASEAN could be fully understood and appreciated only if approached from the perspectives of ASEAN, and in this case, a Filipino diplomats. I'm making a few recommendations in this study. One of them is future researchers can expound some more the role of the chairmanship, because if you're chair, you have the ability to move certain topics or certain issues that you think could shape the political and socioeconomic landscape. So future researchers can do some more study on that. Future scholars can also conduct an ethnographic study of how ASEAN's external partners, on the other hand, react to ASEAN's insistence on ASEAN centrality. And I'd like fellow diplomats, Filipinos, ASEAN, ASEANites, and others to use autoethnography in undertaking studies about ASEAN, ASEAN centrality, ASEAN diplomacy, etc. I'd like to give a small tip for diplomats. The briefing papers can be enhanced to include some personal perspectives about the people, the issues, etc., to help you recall incidents later on when you're doing your own autoethnography. I want ASEAN diplomats to continue insisting or practicing ASEAN centrality in the manner that I just described, and corporate strategists, those who are dealing with ASEAN, international organizations, or even universities, etc., will gain a lot if they use the perspectives on this definition that I just advanced when dealing with ASEAN. It is a good way to understand ASEAN and know how it works, what it can and cannot do, what it is and what it is not. Thank you all very much for listening. I'd be very happy to accept your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador, for your very interesting and very charming lecture. Before we listen to our speakers, I'm informing everyone that you can send in your questions on the Q&A window. Okay. And now for our reactors. First, please welcome Her Excellency Maria Helen de la Vega, Philippine Ambassador to Australia.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, all from cold Canberra here in Australia. I'd like to thank the Asian Center and the UPOU, and of course, Dean Santa Rita, for your kind invitation to me to be a reactor panel in today's seminar on ASEAN Centrality by the Honorable Ambassador Elizabeth Buensuceso. Let me also extend my double congratulations to Ambassador Beth, as we fondly call her in ASEAN. First, for her pioneering research on ASEAN centrality using autoethnography as a framework. And second, on her assumption as DFA's senior official. We all know your portfolio will include attendance in senior officials meeting and other related meetings of ASEAN. So the Philippine Embassy in Canberra salutes you, Yusek Beth. My warm greetings also go to Director Bala of the ASEAN Secretariat. I remember we last saw each other here in Canberra last year during the course of the visit of His Excellency ASEAN Secretary General Lim Jock Hoi. As many of you are aware, Australia is the oldest dialogue partner of ASEAN. And of course, to all the participants and viewers of this lecture forum, I really appreciate your interest on ASEAN affairs. Now, let me go to my reactions to the presentation made by Yusek or Ambassador Beth. For most of us engaged in ASEAN matters quite for some time now, we would consider discussions on ASEAN centrality, because I think we already sort of reach, shall we say, an understanding on these 5 dimensions of ASEAN centrality. First is the centrality within us. That means the centrality among the 10 members of ASEAN. The second is the centrality in regional flashpoints. The third is the centrality vis-a-vis the major powers. Fourth is the centrality vis-a-vis regional architecture. And finally, centrality beyond ASEAN. The auto-ethnographic analytical framework adopted by Ambassador Beth is pioneering. This is the first time, in my own reckoning, that a Filipino diplomat, being the researcher herself, is the subject of analysis, reflecting on her direct experiences in her capacity as then Philippine permanent representative to ASEAN, with a sharper focus on a specific period, the 50th anniversary and Philippine chairmanship of ASEAN in 2017. Indeed, an important milestone for the Southeast Asian region. Her direct participation in negotiations, shaping them to advance our national priorities and strike a balance with regional interests, and her involvement with the different mechanisms under her purview in Jakarta gives her research study and its outcome a deep sense of authenticity on what it truly means to be a practitioner of ASEAN centrality. So in layman's term, to live it out and navigate the many layers of strategic dynamics in her daily grind of work during the chairmanship year is something really worth telling. These direct experiences and lessons are valuable and makes her a mentor in her own right, whose insights contribute in large measure to understanding ASEAN diplomacy and centrality. I think we can all agree that we do not have enough literature of this nature. Hence, her recommendation for other Filipino diplomats or ASEAnologists to pursue the autoethnography model in their research. I also note that in her research study, there was a greater focus on ASEAN centrality vis-a-vis its external partners. In particular, ASEAN centrality in regional architecture, where she shepherded, for instance, outcome documents on functional areas of cooperation in the ASEAN Plus Ones, in the APT, and she really took some time out to discuss in detail, for instance, in the East Asia meetings in Jakarta. She also mentioned in the early part of her presentation the ASEAN centrality in regional flashpoints, citing the South China Sea and the Northern Rakhine State concerns. I'm therefore glad that in her conclusion, she made some recommendations where she encouraged future researchers to undertake more studies on ASEAN centrality. And if I may, I wish to encourage ASEAnologists to be more equally interested in deeper research on ASEAN centrality from within, or promoting ASEAN centrality among us, the 10 member states of ASEAN. Because this dimension of ASEAN centrality from within takes on a vision where ASEAN is more robust, characterized by stronger unity and cohesiveness, and duly supported by strengthened mechanisms to respond effectively in a timely manner to new or emerging developments and challenges. We have been discussing this as early as 2009, and now it's 2020, and there seems to be an urgent need to really look at these things. More so because of the contestation and the strategic rivalry happening in the region today. In essence, what I'm trying to say is that we cannot share or give something outside of ourselves if internally we remain in want or we remain wanting. I think it is important to embrace a fundamental truth about our organization and our community. We came together and banded together, bringing with us diverse histories, different political, socio-economic backgrounds, cultural beliefs, faiths, and value systems. And 53 years after, despite and in spite of this huge diversity and differences among us, we continue to see a community more determined to realize and live in a region thriving in peace and prosperity. Nearly within its reach, its ASEAN vision of year 2025 of a people-centered, people-oriented, rules-based ASEAN. Only ASEAN can fully appreciate and determine the right mix of neutrality, resiliency, moderation, tolerance, accommodation, and imagination to balance national and regional interests to draw out ASEAN's own brand of centrality. And as Ambassador Beth's findings indicate, the ASEAN chair, as leader of that year, shepherds this particular nature, this particular brand of ASEAN neutrality. For me, our brand of ASEAN centrality is neither a natural outcome nor an accident. For me, ASEAN centrality is an offshoot, a byproduct of the 53 years of close adherence by member states to the 6 principles of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. Our founding fathers worked hard for it to bring the next generation of ASEAN citizens in good stead. It was our anchor yesterday, it remains to be so today, and will be so for the future. But that can be the subject of another webinar in the future. But for the moment, I can just say my congratulations, extend my congratulations to Ambassador Beth and her generosity for sharing with us her research study. Salamat po, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador De La Vega. And for our next reactor, please welcome Bala Palanakpian, Director of External Relations, ASEAN Political Security Community Department, ASEAN Secretariat.
Thank you very much, Professor Palumbari. First of all, I would like to thank the UP's Asian and the UP's Open University ASEAN Studies Graduate Program for inviting me to participate in this important webinar. Her Excellency Ambassador Elizabeth, Undersecretary of Policy and SOM Leader of the Philippines, I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate you on your recent appointment as a senior official of the Philippines. Her Excellency Ambassador Helen, Ambassador of the Philippines to Australia, Professor Saludades, Vice Chancellor for Finance and Admin of UPOU, Professor Santa Rita, Dean of UP Asian Center, and dear participants. On this occasion, it will be remiss of me not highlighting the very important role both Ambassador Elizabeth and Ambassador Helen played in steering the Philippines chairmanship of ASEAN in 2017. I was closely working with all of them. I can vouch for all those things they have said, how challenging it was for both of them. And it clearly demonstrates to me how they skillfully overcame many of the challenges, including those mentioned by Ambassador Elizabeth as well as Ambassador Helen. Touching on Ambassador Elizabeth's lecture, research on ASEAN centrality using autoethnography approach, which is, I must confess, I'm also hearing it for the first time, particularly the 3 dimensions of ASEAN centrality that she highlighted. One is ASEAN's leadership role, in regional affairs. Two is centrality as a principle of diplomacy, with ASEAN playing the dominant role in regional affairs, as well as centrality in raising the awareness of ASEAN. I think these are very three important dimensions, in my opinion, are very well framed by Ambassador Elizabeth from a diplomat's perspective and insider experience. And all those examples were given by both ambassadors. And I see that this fits very well within the five dimensions, as Ambassador Helen said, the five dimensions that ASEAN has been advocating on is centrality. That the five dimensions is centrality within ASEAN and centrality within the regional flashpoints, centrality vis-a-vis major powers and dialogue partners, as well as centrality vis-a-vis regional architecture and centrality beyond ASEAN. These terminologies that we use in ASEAN may sound very bureaucratic language and very sometimes may be ambiguous for people to understand when they go into details. But here again, we see how excellently Ambassador Elizabeth has managed to frame the five dimensions of centrality into three key dimensions, which are a lot more easier to understand, clearly defined. I think very much in the early part of her lecture, she talked about the need to clearly define this centrality concept. And I think she has managed to do that very well in a lecture, and I think in her research as well. The autoethnography approach also makes the application of centrality as a principle of diplomacy for ASEAN to be well understood, and in the process remove as much possible the ambiguities to comprehend such a concept that ASEAN employs in coordinating regional cooperation as well as engaging our external partners. On this occasion also, please also allow me to highlight some demonstration of ASEAN centrality in the current COVID-19 pandemic situation that we are all going through. One is while ASEAN, as I think most of you are aware, very successful in projecting our convening power, the power of convening. So ASEAN over the years have managed to attract major powers, major players, dialogue partners, and come and engage, interact, dialogue, cooperate with ASEAN. I think this is one of the strongest power of strength of ASEAN. However, this COVID-19 pandemic has made physical meetings no longer viable until the immediate future. So thus far, ASEAN has managed to very quickly transform itself to virtual platforms, and we are trying our very best to having virtual meetings. And the last big meeting that we had was the meeting among the leaders themselves came online to a virtual meeting to show that in a time of challenging times like this, we can come together and pull together our strength and address issues at hand. So the convening of the summit in June this year is a very good example of ASEAN centrality again at play. This is ASEAN centrality within us. And very soon we will also be having the annual ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting with among ASEAN member states, as well as ministers from many other countries, as many as 26 countries. We will be meeting we will be having the Foreign Ministers meeting. And here again, it shows how ASEAN is playing a central role in a challenging time like this. Second, I would also like to highlight is that COVID-19 pandemic has also tested ASEAN's unity and cohesiveness in a scale unheard of in its 53 years history. The efforts made by our health sector, ASEAN's very own health sector, in collaborating with our external partners, including what we call our +3 countries, China, Japan, and Korea, have shown ASEAN is capable of responding collectively to address urgent issues of common concern. ASEAN should also ensure that its efforts to mitigate the impact of the pandemic are felt by every citizen in this region, as well as increase ASEAN's value and credibility as a key responder to challenges in the heart and minds of its people. This is yet another demonstration of our centrality. I think both ambassadors have also highlighted the increasing major power rivalry, and this is something that cannot be avoided, and this is something that the ASEAN has to handle. And it's not easy. We have no choice but stick together and not get caught in the conflict of the major power in order to force ASEAN to take one side or the other. We have to skillfully manage such situations. I think both ambassadors have shown their skill in chairing Philippine Championship in 2017. They also faced similar experiences, and Ambassador Elizabeth has also cited some of the experiences, including one document that we negotiated, and at the last minute we have to drop it because it clearly shows that the interest of our region was at stake, and we cannot go along with that. And Ambassador Elizabeth showed her leadership in that particular moment. It is very late at night, I remember, and we have to take a very serious action on that, and it was done. Looking ahead, discussions have also begun on crafting the ASEAN post-2025 vision, the vision for the next 10 years post-2025. In this context, I think it is also will be timely for ASEAN to take a closer look at the centrality concept with the view to examine whether we are on the right track, taking into account the evolving geopolitical and economic landscape in this region. We need to also continue to examine ourselves to ensure the centrality is relevant and is able to respond to challenges. As ASEAN must also be mindful that centrality is not a right, but a privilege and recognition that it has earned over the years, and it has to continue to keep that centrality through ideas, actions, cohesiveness, and credibility of action that we undertake in our daily work in promoting regional cooperation and cooperation between ASEAN and our partners. In other words, we in ASEAN, we cannot be complacent with this centrality that we have earned over the years. We need to also be agile and adapt to the changes around us to serve the best interests of ASEAN. And I certainly welcome the recommendations that Ambassador Elizabeth has put forward to encourage more research on ASEAN centrality. With that, I would like to end my comment on her lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director Palanyapan. And for our last and final reactor, please welcome Dr. Jofi Santarita, Dean of the Asian Center.
Thank you very much, Dr. Palumbarit. Salamat sorry. Mayong hapon. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. We are fortunate to listen to the discussion of Ambabeth Buensuceso about her up-close and personal encounter with ASEAN centrality. I'm also happy to be the last speaker. So I can always say I concur to the previous speakers. But yes, after having this discussion, after the distinguished speakers with ASEAN familiarity, Ambassador Helen and Director Balakumar, thank you very much. Thus, your work will really unload me of several points to tackle and save me a few more minutes to share my thoughts. So, first of all, the narrative of a close encounter with ASEAN centrality was done using the not frequently employed research methodology, the autoethnography. So I will not dwell on that lengthily, but just to emphasize that it is possible to employ research method in anyone's research project and even reporting as for diplomats like Ambabeth. So to sift the many points or ideas coming from the discussion of Ambabeth, I believe that the several institutions and individuals are involved to realize the ASEAN centrality. While I acknowledge the importance of institutions like ASEAN as a regional body and its various offices and mechanisms, the individuals are similarly important in the realization of ASEAN centrality. So the anecdotes mentioned by Ambabeth are not just for our entertainment or for our information, but these are the realities of the hard jobs performed by an individual or groups of individuals who are serving as major players in the institution that promotes centrality in the context of its relations with its immediate and extended neighbors. So after listening to Ambabeth, the work of Ambabeth as as an advocate as well as a student somehow resonates the work of, if you're familiar, of Dr. Kwan Cheng Chen, Asia as Method, published in 2010, which describes as multiplying or multiply frames of reference in our subjectivity and worldview through the unique histories and cultures of Asian histories, or Asian societies rather, and this time ASEAN. Thus, I conclude that the ASEAN centrality is not just a concept or fundamental principle, but also as a method. I say that ASEAN centrality as a method because of the following points mentioned by Ambassador Buensuceso. And let me just give you some of these points or enumerate some points. First, the idea of ASEAN centrality as an expression of ASEAN leadership in the region. And this is best exemplified by the Philippine chairmanship of ASEAN in 2012 with more or less about 29 major milestone documents operating on the theme partnering for change, engaging the world. And some of these achievements are the mentioned Manila Consensus on Migrant Workers, the framework for the conduct of the South China Sea or in the South China Sea, gender mainstreaming in all three pillars of the ASEAN community, and many more. What really strikes me is the ability to convince, if not pleading, to the members to include the protection and promotion of the welfare of migrant workers in the Middle East or in the West Asia, to be politically correct, even when it was not considered a priority area in one plan of action in the table of negotiation, is already a good example of the manifestation of ASEAN centrality. The second point is that ASEAN centrality as a principle of ASEAN diplomacy with, of course, ASEAN playing as the dominant role. I will not use the work of Lee Kuan Yew saying that, you know, the ASEAN is like an airplane, a Boeing 747 with India and China on the both wings. But I can say that, you know, though it's more small, ASEAN is like a boat with all so many rows, demonstrating the resilience of the organization through time. For example, the individuals who work in the ASEAN have great influence in the success of the regional body and the realization of the centrality. I have come to this assumption that the success of the regional body is highly dependent also to the character of people who are operating it, the ability to establish rapport with their counterparts and various stakeholders, and also has that ability to discern on who to avoid is very important. Also, the ability to use the ASEAN way of informal, non-confrontational tone and language in settling rather than embarrassing situations is really very important, involving overcoming bureaucratic snags, as mentioned by Ambabeth, in some member states without causing any problem and without anyone noticing the quiet solution offered. ASEAN centrality is also illustrated when individuals or players are able to part the bilateral issues by choosing the path of peace and manage these disputes and differences the ASEAN way, thereby demonstrating its capacity to practice what we call as centrality. Furthermore, I think it is also the ability to convince diplomatic world, usually dominated by men, to give attention to the welfare of women, as exemplified by the establishment mentioned by IPAR and of course the ASEAN Women for Peace and Reconciliation. This particular initiative on centrality would enhance the participation of women in peace and reconciliation process. I think Ambabeth also mentioned about ASEAN centrality and the ability to diffuse the lecturing of Western external partner on an issue that divided the players and use, I may use the word, civil way of accommodating such irritant without shaming them in public. This is an Asian way of saving a face. It's also the ability to insist and even convince partners of following ASEAN's own format. So they are following it, our own agenda, and our own objectives in the conduct of our own meetings. Moreover, centrality is demonstrated by beating the stonewalling strategy, as mentioned by Ambabeth, of some external partners serving maybe as a stumbling blocks to the finalization of important documents for ASEAN. And I think what is good that the ASEAN centrality is best demonstrated with the exercise in terms of insistence of ASEAN to add maritime cooperation as a focus area of collaboration, despite the stiff opposition. So in negotiation, ASEAN centrality is best felt by tackling the easier points first and reserving resolution of the stickier issues last, which is also a good negotiating technique. This is a clear proof that Mushawara Mufakat is really working. So I can say that ASEAN centrality, I believe and I agree with the observation of Ambabeth that ASEAN centrality is an expression of ASEAN leadership in the region, and it is a principle of diplomacy practiced by ASEAN diplomats, whereby the regional body is the dominant player. And this was shown in various participation to several ASEAN-led mechanisms, both in Jakarta and elsewhere, discussing and advancing ASEAN's agenda following the approved formats of the ASEAN event procedures and processes enunciated in a tone or language called ASEAN Way. So after listening to this, I have some questions or realizations to trigger the open forum and might share similar questions from our audience. First, that the success of an institution is just as good only when there is a successful, effective, and efficient player or players operating the said institution. Second, that ASEAN centrality is not just one among the many topics in the talk shop, quote unquote. Rather, this principle has its own life and managed by people who breathe and live with it. Third, without declaring or exhibiting it in public, ASEAN centrality is beginning to be embedded in the consciousness of the partners and external players negotiating with ASEAN. So it's just like a turntable reminding them of ASEAN centrality. Whether they like it or not, they will like it. Fourth, the ASEAN centrality and its successful implementation is partly shaped, influenced by gender, and perhaps Ambabeth and Amba Helen of charm. So I will end with these points, which I hope Ambabeth and perhaps Amba Helen and Director Bala may address in the open forum. Thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak, Madam Udin. Salamat.
Thank you very much, Dean Santarita. And now let's listen to Ambassador Buen Suceso's response or responses to our reactors' points of view.
Thank you very much to all the very useful contributions of our reactors. Ambassador Helen de la Vega from Australia, Dean Joffe Santarita, Asian Center, and Director Bala Kumar Palapyanan. Now I have a mind to rewrite again my study, having listened to your very valuable contributions. You see, this is one thing I was not able to explain earlier. In fact, I have one question here from an audience that is similar to what that is reflective of what I'm going to explain now in relation to how I am reacting to your, how will one ensure that the research is not too introspective in using autoethnography. I think she is trying to differentiate the difference between a memoir, an autobiography, and an autoethnography. I also saw a number of questions. In fact, maybe one listener was not able to catch me saying it is autoethnography, it's not autobiography. So there are differences among the three terms, but the experience of writing and autoethnography is already a subject of its study itself. You see, Ambassador de la Vega and Director Bala will share this experience that I'm going to relate now to you. We have been trained to become objective uh, uh, writers, reporters of events, analysts, etc., using statistics, using the male voice of diplomacy. I'm sorry to say, in the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, there are more women diplomats than in most other countries. You can witness that right now. However, the voice of diplomacy is still the macho voice, especially in subjects like chemical weapons, cybersecurity, counterterrorism. It's still the macho voice. And so therefore, when writing this study, I experienced some kind of a dilemma. I was using the reportorial style of writing. And it was a big blow to my ego. And I thank really very much Dr. Jean Saludades, Vice Chancellor Jean Saludades. She was frank enough to point that out to me. I am using the reportorial style of writing, while autoethnography allows you to be uh, reflexive, to talk about yourself and to use the feminine voice of autoethnography. And to answer the question I read just now about that Miss Lay posted, um, the model I explained just now of Leon Anderson allows you to study a serious subject like diplomacy without being too emotional, too introspective. It gives you a middle ground because it allows you to, to study a serious subject while focusing on the self and even sometimes recalling emotional and emotive narratives or vignettes. So this is the beauty of autoethnography, which I am encouraging our diplomats and even our colleagues from the ASEAN Secretariat to follow. Yes, as long as Ambassador and maybe Bala is on all the 3 pillars of the being. Like in 27 leaders' declarations that are gender sensitive were adopted by the leaders. One, as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned, was on women, peace, and security. And the other one is to ensure that gender sensitive responses or gender mainstreaming is present in all the 3 pillars. And it was the Philippines that championed this. The Philippines hosted in 3 consecutive years the mainstreaming of the of gender mainstreaming in the socio-economic pillar 1 year, another year in the economic pillar, and another year in the political and security pillar. I think that was last year. I have so many interesting questions here. I have very little time, so allow me the privilege now to answer some of the questions. But I already combined my response to the reactions, as well as one question on the methodology that I used. But thank you all very much, Ambassador Helen. As I said, she was the other side of my coin. And I hope that you can write your own autoethnography someday. Or being the other side of the coin in the home office, you had your own battles to fight as far as autoethnography, ASEAN centrality is concerned. I have a few interesting questions here. Professor Palumbarit, may I already discuss the questions so that because I don't have much time.
Yes, please, Ambassador, you may proceed to answer the questions.
Okay. There were many questions about ASEAN centrality now being affected by the COVID pandemic. I think there were about six already alluded to ASEAN response. A few days ago, or
I think there's
months ago, the leaders of ASEAN on their response to the pandemic. And what's happening is that the pandemic pandemic recovery program of the ASEAN Secretariat is being refined and enhanced by getting inputs from the private sector, from the government sectors, from the peoples of ASEAN, so that it will shape the what ASEAN will do as a group, as an organization in the coming years, because the effects, the ravages of the pandemic will be upon us in the immediate future and for many more years to come. In fact, I will tell you, every important meeting now, every important document now, the focus is really on an ASEAN response. Secretary General Lim Chok Hoy he would like to see a regional program to be holistic, be inclusive, to be gender sensitive, and to be environmentally sensitive. So what I'm saying is that if at all, because it is a common threat to the very security of the peoples and the countries of ASEAN and in the region, in fact, in the whole world. So be rest assured, dear friends, that ASEAN, of course, each country, even if each province, each island, will have its own national or regional or provincial response to COVID. But I assure you that there is a regional response. And in fact, Director Bala mentioned the creation of the ASEAN Response Fund. And already a number of countries have expressed their willingness to contribute to this fund. And the fund doesn't cover only, a single phase. It's holistic. It may cover a lot of areas, including well, the health issue, the economic issue, even the social or even cultural issues, because the cultural field is also very much affected now by the pandemic. So anyway, I have some questions here. This is a very good question. Do you think, our listener is saying, that the principle of ASEAN consensus is more a blessing than a curse, or curse rather than a blessing? So, because this question, I have encountered this several times whenever I speak in many forums. And, there's this usual attack on ASEAN consensus. ASEAN doesn't have consensus on this and that, etc., etc. I want to recall an article or a book written by Peter Drisdale. The title is ASEAN Regionalism, an Experiment in Regionalism That Succeeded. And in that book, he says, and I fully agree with him, it is the principle of consensus which allowed ASEAN to achieve the kind of success that it has attained to this day. In one section of my study, I write about the precursors of ASEAN, the predecessors of ASEAN. Why did they fail? They failed because there was no ASEAN consensus. There was no buy-in into the objectives and the principles of those predecessor organizations. It is because of ASEAN consensus that ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is the successful regional organization that it is today. Because people see that they have something in it for them. And so they participate in it, they support it, they defend it. You know, ASEAN has many faults. I know that. Ambassador de la Vega knows that. Director Bala knows that. It has so many faults, but it has also been able to address the kind of regional needs that we have, and that's why 53 years hence after its establishment, it is considered to be not just one of the, but some writers say the most successful regional organization in the world, despite its many warts and pimples. Anyway, another question here is, so for me, it's not a curse, it's a blessing. It has its many deficiencies, but ASEAN consensus, despite the many differences. I don't know, you know, I come from a family of 12 siblings. We're also different from each other. And yet, you know, we try to live with one another, accommodating one another. Even if, you know, uh, Professor Santa Rita, Professor Jean, you are a master of ASEAN, you know, thinking. ASEAN has so many divergent backgrounds, religions, culture, languages, etc. And yet we are in one regional organizations. I have a section in the study that talks about that. Anyway, another question here is that what is the future of ASEAN? Do you think that it should be like the EU, having supranational bodies such as the European Commission, European Council, etc.? Former Secretary General Ong Keng Yong has a very good answer to this. You know, you will not ask a hen or a chicken to quack, quack, quack when it's not a duck, he said. So ASEAN, in fact, I also put this in, devoted a section in my study. ASEAN has never, and perhaps not in the near future, aspire to be like the EU because it has its own unique characteristics, as mentioned in the study. It has its own way of solving problems. It has its own way of addressing difficult issues without resorting to the kind of supranational sovereignty that the EU exercises. I am not saying that the EU system is wrong. It is good for them, but ASEAN is good for ASEAN. So I don't think that we will resort to an EU system in the near future. Another good question is, how can we introduce or promote ASEAN to ordinary Filipinos? I would like to congratulate the ASEAN Secretariat, especially your public relations section, Bala, because in the past, Secretariat didn't even have a social media function. So right now, what the Secretariat is doing is to bring ASEAN to ordinary people. If you log on to the ASEAN Secretariat website, they have many tools there to bring ASEAN to ordinary people. In I had aspired to raise the level of awareness of ASEAN among people is the very dismal result of two studies undertaken by the ASEAN Foundation and ARIA, the East Asian Research Economic Institute for Asia and ASEAN. The level of awareness, the results of those studies pointed to a very low level of awareness. But I want you to visit the 2018 awareness survey that the ASEAN Secretariat conducted. You know, after our chairmanship, because the Philippine government really spent a lot of resources, Ambassador de la Vega is is instrumental in raising the level of awareness among ordinary people of ASEAN. And true enough, that investment paid off. The level of ASEAN is very high. So chairmanships can also play a big role in upscaling knowledge or awareness among people of ASEAN what ASEAN does for them. I also want to invite our friends to visit the ASEAN Foundation. The ASEAN Foundation is another body based in Jakarta. I didn't talk about it in my study because it doesn't really deal much with external partners, but it is the platform of ASEAN in engaging the academies, the think tanks, students, the youth, etc. And I'd like to commend the efforts of the former executive director of ASEAN, another woman, I must say, Miss Elaine Tan, who has really revived the image of the ASEAN Foundation and really made use of it as the platform to engage non-government people in raising the level of awareness. So, okay, I'm seeing a lot of questions on COVID-19. Please direct your question to Director Bala. He knows more about the ASEAN response to the COVID pandemic. That's also the question of great variations, etc. I said the national response is different from the regional response. And so therefore, you know, in unity, we have strength. And 2 days ago, last week, I participated in the SOMS, and then 2 days ago, in the agenda of ASEAN. It is the first thing that we discuss now. What do we do in the immediate future and in the years to come? And it's not just talk. We accompany our talk with practical modalities such as providing funds, helping each other, you know, help our people recover from the pandemic. I have 4 minutes, so let me answer one more question. But this person is asking, how about you know, you're not united in issues like South China Sea? You know, we don't use the word Rohingya because according to our Myanmar friends, Rohingya already stipulates citizenship on the people, and that's one of the most important issues being discussed. What I'm saying in my study is that, in fact, it's the opposite. Despite the presence of this very difficult issue, South China Sea is a very difficult and intractable issue. And yet, despite this very difficult issue, ASEAN has been able to maintain peace and stability in the region. And as I mentioned earlier, the many bilateral disputes also threaten the peace and stability of the region. There is an ASEAN consensus, or there are several points of ASEAN consensus on the South China Sea. Number one is that it uh, peace and stability in the region is of prime importance to the states, to the member states of ASEAN. That's a consensus. Nobody is disputing that. The second item in the consensus is that ASEAN does not take sides on who owns what. This is mine, this is yours, etc. The Philippines, for example, went to the Permanent Court of Arbitration to settle some cases or some questions that it had brought before that court. Sides, what it is more concerned about is the peace and stability in the region. And there is consensus to not use force, to not use intimidation, to restrain from actions that will exacerbate that will escalate the tensions. These are ASEAN consensus, the points of ASEAN consensus on the issue of South China Sea. Of course, the Philippines would like to all ASEAN member states to agree with it. That's what we like. And the other claimant states as well. But in that area, there is no ASEAN consensus because, as I said, ASEAN doesn't want to be the body to arbitrate or to decide who owns what in the region. Somebody is asking about the Northern Rakhine. I am telling you that it is not an issue swept under the rug. A lot has to be done by Myanmar and all the other parties. But I'm telling you that away from the blare of the microphones and away from media, the cameras of media, ASEAN is discussing this issue. In my study, I say, for example, that I witnessed one ASEAN retreat where the issue was discussed, not in a naming and shaming way, but they inquired from Myanmar, how can we help? And so right after that, Myanmar talked with Bangladesh about bilateral responses to this issue. And then Secretary General was allowed or was invited to send a rapid response team to go to Myanmar to find out how ASEAN can help. So this is the kind of intervention that ASEAN is doing on very difficult and very intractable issues, such as those that I just mentioned. Dear friends, I really, really appreciate the questions. I have so many things to say yet, but it is 4 o'clock. Maybe watch out for the next autoethnography to be written by Ambassador de la Vega and by Director Bala. And they will answer your questions as well. Thank you all very much. UPOU Vice Chancellor Jean Saluzades, Dean Jofe Santa Rita, all the nice people in the Asian Center. I already also studied in the Asian Center 100 years ago. So it's a different one now. It is responsive to digital modalities of education. Ma'am Jean, you are now very well sought after because of your track experience in online education, which you made popular even before COVID. So I wish you all best wishes. Thank you all for reuniting me with my dear friends, Ambassador de la Vega and Director Bala. And all the best to all of you. We will fight COVID the ASEAN way.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Buen Suceso, for your very interesting and very passionate lecture. Okay, and to formally close our program, may I request Professor Medina, Maria Cecil Medina, faculty, Asian Center, and assistant to the dean, okay, for administration and public affairs.
Good afternoon to everyone. It is really a great privilege and my pleasure to say a few words at the end of this webinar. We at the Asian Center of the University of the Philippines are very grateful for this opportunity to hold this event in the midst of the pandemic as a continuing part of our lecture series, public lecture series on Asia contemporary issues. And we are privileged also to partner with the UP Open University ASEAN program, of which we have always been in the past also working with. I feel very honored and privileged really to listen to a seasoned diplomat in the person of Ambassador Buen Suceso and to learn from the different input given by Ambassador De La Vega, Director Balakumar, and of course our Dean Santa Rita. We cannot express our gratitude enough for all these inputs. I'm sure students of the UP Open University and the UP Asian Center, especially on Southeast Asia Studies and ASEAN Studies, will benefit a lot from this, and the public in general also. I believe everyone will agree that we have exceeded really our expectations and meeting our objectives for this afternoon. What with the excellent presentations and inputs given by our panelists. Not only did the event highlight what ASEAN centrality is or deepen our understanding of what it is, including its practice, as we have diplomats in the panel. But I am sure we have become more convinced of the importance of addressing many issues in the region, also by learning more still about ASEAN centrality and Southeast Asian issues. We are challenged by this, no? And all of us, panelists and the virtual audience, I guess are left with the task or responsibility to continually add to that knowledge that we have learned today. It is our duty as citizens of ASEAN. And hopefully, by doing so and promoting this awareness, we can contribute to the growth and development of ASEAN and also face the many challenges, the very critical times. So while this event has ended, I'm sure there are many questions that the ambassador would like to still continually answer, and many would. This is not the end, no? So we look forward to meeting everyone again, gathering again in future public lecture series, and to be able to deepen more on different Asian issues. So thank you once again to all who have collaborated, and especially also even to our technical people in the UP Computer Center and our own staff in the Research and Publications Office and Information Office of the Asian Center. And of course, collaborating with the UPOU. So congratulations to everyone and good day to all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Medina. And before we leave you all with UP Naming Mahal, the Asian Center, UP, University of the Philippines, Diliman, and University of the Philippines Open University would like to thank you all for being with us today. And also we would like to thank the Computer Center, University of the Philippines, Diliman, for hosting this event. And of course, to our staff, Janice, Danae, and Jane, thank you very much for making this event very much possible. So with that, we hope to see you all in our future webinars. And stay safe, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amba Beth, Amba Helen, Director Balakumar, and of course, the VC Jean, and the rest of the Asian Center faculty. Thank you very much. Faculty and staff, of course. Thank you to Janus, Danae, Jane, and of course, Julian of the Tri-College PhD Philippine Studies Program. Maraming salamat po sa ating mga attendees all over the Philippines and beyond. Maraming salamat po at hanggang sa susunod na mga lectures. Thank you very much, Director Balakumar. We're saying
Thank you.
Until the next, maybe we can invite you to present on the COVID-19 response of the ASEAN in the next webinar. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you.
Amba Helen, maraming salamat.
Thank you, Ma'am Helen and Ma'am Beth.
Maraming salamat
And
din po.
And ingat po kayo sa Australia.
Director Kamar.
Thank you po. Thank you, Dr. Palumbarit and Dr. Medina and Professor Talampas. Janos, congratulations. Danae, Jane, and Julie, maraming salamat. Of course, Donna, and of course, the Computer Center, maraming salamat. Hanggang sa muli sa susunod na lecture.
Dean, pictures daw.
Okay, so we can have a picture. So, yes, please go ahead. Can we have the video on before we go? Video, Danae, Jane, Janus, and Julie, and of course, Army, please. Video first. Video on. Danae and Jane.
Si Danae at si Jane.
Wala sa Rolia. Janus, can you take the photo before we?
Yes, sir. I will do a screenshot. Okay. So
Yes.
1, 2, 3. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Director. Thank you, Amba.
Thank you po.
Thank you, Amba Beth, Amba Helen. Thank you, VCG.